The last drop of hope. Callum Drake wasn't one to believe in destiny. He was a human smuggler, driven by the profit to be made from the rough edges of the galaxy. His life was one of calculated risk, where each decision was weighed for its potential gain or loss. But today, as he trudged across the searing hot sands of Traskar, a planet that no one would ever consider hospitable, he had the uneasy sense that his story was about to take an unexpected turn. The Iron Phoenix, his battered yet reliable freighter, had been grounded by an unpredictable ion storm. His cargo of precious crystals was supposed to have been delivered days ago, but now, with his ship's systems malfunctioning and no other options available, Callum found himself stranded in a desolate wilderness. He couldn't even make a distress call. His communication system had been fried. All he had was his equipment, his knowledge of survival, and a hope that he could make it to the nearest spaceport before his food and water ran out. It wasn't supposed to be this way. The endless dunes stretched in every direction. The air shimmered with the brutal heat of the midday sun, making every step feel like a struggle. Each breath he took was dry, scraping his throat. His canteen had long since run dry, and the sweat on his brow only added to the unbearable weight of the situation. He knew he had no choice but to keep moving forward toward what he hoped was a refuge, any kind of sign of life. But then something strange caught his attention in the distance. Through the haze of the shimmering heat, Callum spotted a figure. It was a silhouette of a humanoid form, kneeling on the sand. At first, he thought it might be some kind of mirage, the heat playing tricks on his mind. But as he drew closer, the figure became clearer, and he could see it was a woman. An alien woman. Her skin glowed with an ethereal, sky-blue hue, and her long, flowing hair shimmered like strands of gold, even in the blinding desert sun. The alien woman was kneeling beside a large creature, a feline-like animal, but not anything Callum had ever seen before. It had fur that seemed to glisten, almost like liquid sapphire, and its body was massive, yet graceful, its breathing labored and weak. The creature's massive paws were pressed against the sand as it lay sprawled out, struggling to stay alive in the sweltering heat. The alien woman's eyes were wide with panic as she cradled the creature's head, trying desperately to comfort it, her hands trembling as she whispered soothing words in a language Callum couldn't understand. Something about the scene struck a chord with him. The woman's desperation, the sadness in her eyes, the gentle way she treated the animal. This was not a sight you saw every day. Callum wasn't a hero, and he wasn't one to get involved in other people's problems. But as he watched her, something stirred within him, a feeling he couldn't explain. He hesitated for a moment, his instincts telling him to turn back, to return to his ship and save himself. But then the creature whimpered again, its eyes fluttering weakly. The alien woman looked up, her face drenched in sweat and sorrow. She locked eyes with Callum, and for a brief moment, he saw the raw vulnerability in her gaze, the kind of look that told him she was fighting a losing battle. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're dying. They need water." Callum's mind raced. Water. He barely had enough left for himself, let alone for two massive creatures. He had no obligation to help her. This was just some random alien stranded on a planet he couldn't care less about. He didn't even know who she was, but those words echoed in his mind. They need water. It wasn't just the creature's life that depended on it, it was hers too. Against his better judgment, Callum approached her, his boots crunching in the dry sand as he moved closer. His shadow fell over her as she looked up, startled by his sudden presence. Her long lashes fluttered, and a faint blush spread across her cheeks. There was something otherworldly about her beauty, something graceful and serene, even amidst the harshness of the desert. "Hey," Callum called out, trying to sound casual, though he couldn't hide the sympathy creeping into his voice. "Looks like you could use a hand." The alien woman blinked, her lips parting as if she hadn't expected help, then slowly nodded. "Please," she whispered again. "My companions, Nyx and Azora, They're so thirsty. I don't know how much longer they can last. Callum glanced down at the creatures again. Nyx, the larger of the two, was lying still now, its sapphire fur matted with sweat. Azora, the smaller of the two, lay beside it, breathing shallowly. Callum could see the faint rise and fall of their chests, but it wasn't enough. They needed water, quickly. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to the nearly empty canteen hanging from his belt. He had enough water to get back to the ship, but if he gave it away now, it could mean the difference between survival and death for him too. But something gnawed at him. The desperation in the alien's eyes, the way she held her creatures so tenderly, as though they were her family. Callum wasn't used to caring about anyone other than himself. But right now, he couldn't ignore the pull of his conscience. He reached for his canteen, unclipping it from his belt, and handing it to her. "Here," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's not much, but it's all I've got. Make it count." She accepted the canteen with trembling hands, and when her fingers brushed against his, a strange, electric sensation surged through him. He couldn't explain it, but it felt as though a connection had been made. A brief, fleeting moment that made his heart beat just a little faster. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of gratitude. As she carefully tipped the water into Nyx's mouth, Callum watched, almost mesmerized, as the creature licked the water up eagerly. Slowly, its breathing began to steady. Azora, too, began to perk up as the water brought life back to her. "I am Neria of the Andari," the alien woman said, looking up at him once more. "These are my companions, Nyx and Azora. I am forever in your debt." Callum didn't know what to say. He was used to people owing him favors, but this felt different somehow. She wasn't just thanking him. She was acknowledging something deeper, something that made him feel important, even for just a brief moment. He smiled faintly, brushing off the feeling as best as he could. "Callum Drake," he said. "Not a big deal. Just doing what anyone would do." Neria's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, her gratitude evident in every line of her face. Then she stood up, her eyes scanning the barren landscape. "I've been stranded here for 2 cycles," she explained softly. "My ship crashed. Nyx and Azora. They'd been my only companions, my only family. We've been surviving on scraps, barely making it." Callum felt a pang of sympathy, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. He still had a ship to fix, a mission to complete, and a limited supply of resources. Yet, as he looked at Neria and her creatures, the weight of his decision began to sink in. He didn't have to do this. He didn't have to offer any more help. But the thought of leaving her out here, stranded in the desert, didn't sit right with him. "Listen," Callum said, his voice softer now. "I've got a ship not far from here. I can give you a lift to the nearest spaceport, and maybe we can get you some more water for your friends." Neria's eyes widened, and for a moment, it seemed as though she didn't quite believe him. "You would do that for us?" she asked, almost incredulously. "But why?" Callum shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Let's just say I've got a soft spot for people in trouble, and you seem like you could use a break." With that, the two of them set off across the vast desert, Neria's companions following close behind. As the harsh sun beat down on them, Callum's mind wandered to the strange turn his day had taken. He had made many questionable decisions in his life, but this one felt different. He had made a promise, and for some reason, he was determined to see it through. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would change the course of his life forever. The journey begins. The desert stretched endlessly before them, the heat distorting the horizon into a wavering mirage. Callum and Neria moved steadily, her elegant strides in contrast to his more deliberate pace, his boots crunching in the sand. Nyx and Azora, now slightly revived from their desperate dehydration, padded alongside them, their fur shimmering with a strange, otherworldly glow in the relentless sun. Despite the treacherous heat, they moved with purpose, an unspoken bond between the two creatures and their alien caretaker evident in every step. Callum couldn't help but glance over at Neria, who walked beside him. She was silent, her gaze fixed ahead, her posture regal despite her ragged attire. Her once pristine clothing was now torn and stained from days, maybe weeks, of surviving on Traskar, yet there was a quiet dignity about her. Her long golden hair, though disheveled by the desert wind, still seemed to possess a radiant quality, catching the sunlight in a way that made her seem ethereal, like she belonged to a different world altogether. Her skin, a striking shade of deep azure, was like nothing Callum had ever seen before, an exotic beauty that seemed to be born of the stars. So, Callum began, breaking the silence as he wiped the sweat from his brow. "How long have you been stuck out here?" Neria glanced at him, her piercing blue eyes revealing a deep sadness, but also a flicker of hope. "2 cycles," she replied softly, her voice calm but filled with the weight of her experiences. "My ship, it was attacked. Pirates. They were looking for something precious. We were forced to land here, and I haven't been able to contact anyone since." Callum's brow furrowed. He'd heard stories about pirates in the outer rim of the galaxy, but to think they had found Neria's ship was unsettling. Those kinds of raiders were merciless, preying on anyone they could find in the farthest reaches of space. Still, he didn't press her further. There were more pressing concerns. Pirates, not exactly the type of company you want to keep. "No," Neria agreed, her tone distant, "but they left me with no choice. My only concern now is Nyx and Azora. I was trying to keep them alive." But her voice trailed off, and Callum could sense the pain behind her words. She was trying to remain strong, but the loss of her ship, her people, and the danger to her companions was a lot to carry. "Well, I'm glad I found you when I did," Callum said, trying to offer a little comfort, though he wasn't the type for heartfelt words. He had his own demons to deal with. His life had never been about saving others. It was about survival, about getting by. But something about Neria and her situation stirred something inside him, a strange feeling that he couldn't quite shake. They continued to walk, the silence between them filled only by the soft patter of Nyx and Azora's paws on the sand. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the dunes. Callum's thoughts drifted to the Iron Phoenix. His ship, while far from perfect, was his lifeline. Without it, he was just another stranded soul in the vastness of space. The ship's systems had taken a beating from the ion storm, but Callum was resourceful. He had fixed far worse in his time, and the thought of getting back to his ship gave him a small sense of control in an otherwise uncontrollable situation. As the desert began to cool with the setting sun, Neria spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "I never expected to meet someone like you. A human, helping us." Callum raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" "Humans aren't known for their kindness to strangers," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "At least not from the stories I've heard. But you've been nothing but generous. I don't know why you're helping us, but I am grateful." Callum shrugged, trying to brush off the compliment. "Like I said, it's nothing. I've helped my fair share of people in trouble. It's just the way things go sometimes." But as he said the words, a small part of him wondered if that was truly the case. He wasn't known for doing favors without expecting something in return. This felt different, though. It wasn't about credits or favors. It was about something more. "Tell me about your home," Callum asked after a pause, eager to change the subject. "You mentioned Andari, right? What's it like there?" Neria's expression softened at the mention of her home planet. "Andari is beautiful," she began, her eyes glazing over as she spoke of her homeland. "It's a lush planet, filled with green forests, towering crystal spires, and rivers that never run dry. Water is plentiful there, and the sky is always a bright shade of violet. My people have lived in harmony with nature for millennia. We believe that the land and the creatures we share it with are all interconnected, that we must respect and protect them. Her voice held a sense of pride, and Callum could hear the love she had for her world. "Sounds amazing," Callum said, genuinely impressed. He couldn't imagine a place so different from Trasker. But why leave a place like that? What happened? A shadow passed over Neria's face. "I was part of a peacekeeping mission," she said, her tone now quieter. "My people sent me and others like me to different parts of the galaxy to help mediate conflicts, offer assistance to planets in need, and ensure that we remain connected with the broader universe. That's when I came across Trasker. My ship was on a routine mission, bringing supplies to a colony when we were ambushed by the pirates." Callum listened intently. Her story was beginning to paint a picture of a woman who wasn't just a survivor, but someone with a greater purpose, a noble cause that transcended personal gain. "Sounds like you had a pretty important job," Callum remarked. His curiosity piqued. "You were out there doing good in the universe. Why risk everything for your pets?" Neria's eyes softened as she glanced down at Nyx and Azora, the creatures who had become her only family. "They are my family," she said quietly. "I couldn't leave them behind. They've been with me since they were born. They saved my life when I was stranded on another planet years ago. They're not just pets. They're my companions, my protectors, my friends. I owe them everything." Callum nodded, understanding now. "I get it. You do what you have to for those you care about." The conversation shifted as they neared a rise in the dunes, the silhouette of Callum's ship, the Iron Phoenix, now visible against the twilight sky. It looked like a battered, weathered freighter, but to Callum, it was home. The sight of it filled him with a sense of relief, his ticket out of this wasteland, his path to survival. "That's my ship," Callum said, pointing toward it. "It's not much, but it'll get us out of here." Neria looked up at it, her expression unreadable for a moment. "It looks lived in," she said with a soft chuckle. "But I can see why you call it home." Callum smirked. "Don't let the exterior fool you. She's tough. She'll get us where we need to go." As they approached the ship, Neria's companions, Nyx and Azora, seemed to recognize the end of their journey for the time being. They padded quietly to the entrance of the ship, waiting for Callum to open the hatch. "Come on aboard," Callum said, gesturing toward the ramp. "Let's get you some real food, some water, and a little rest. You've earned it." The ramp lowered with a soft hiss, and the cool interior of the Iron Phoenix greeted them with a welcome embrace. It wasn't much, but it was home. And right now, it was a lifeline. As Callum activated the ship's systems, preparing for takeoff, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of purpose in this unexpected alliance. He had no idea where the journey would lead, but he had a feeling it was about to become more complicated and more rewarding than anything he had ever experienced before. The stars beckoned beyond the viewport, and as the engines roared to life, Callum Drake, the rogue smuggler, knew that the galaxy would soon be in for a new kind of story, a story of human ingenuity, resilience, and the kind of bonds that could change the fate of entire worlds. The unseen forces. The Iron Phoenix rumbled to life, its worn engines thrumming beneath Callum's feet as the ship lifted off from the surface of Trasker. Neria, seated beside him in the cockpit, looked out the viewport, her expression soft as she watched the planet fade into the vastness of space. Her long golden hair floated gently in the low gravity of the ship's interior. And for a moment, Callum almost forgot about the hardships she'd endured. She looked peaceful, almost regal, like someone who had never known the depths of struggle. But he knew better. Beneath her composed exterior was a warrior, one who had fought for survival and lost more than most people ever would. "How are they?" Callum asked, breaking the silence as he navigated the ship's controls. The stars stretched ahead of them, a never-ending expanse of light that seemed to mirror the endless possibilities before him. Neria glanced down at Nyx and Azora, who had curled up in the corner of the cockpit, their large forms filling the space. They had been quiet for most of the journey, their exhaustion from the desert heat and dehydration still evident, but both creatures seemed more at ease now, their breathing steady and rhythmic. "They're better," Neria said softly. "Thank you for giving them the water. They needed it more than I did. I wasn't sure if they would survive the desert without it." "Glad I could help," Callum muttered, his focus still on the controls as he adjusted their course. He was used to working alone, but this felt different. It wasn't just about getting from point A to point B anymore. He found himself strangely invested in their well-being, something he hadn't expected. The ship's engine hummed steadily as it left the orbit of Traskar behind. They were heading toward the nearest spaceport on a planet called Seraphis, a bustling hub of trade and commerce, where Callum could hopefully get his ship's systems repaired and gather the resources he'd need to finish his mission. But as they sailed farther into the depths of space, a growing unease settled in Callum's gut. The kind of unease you feel when you know you're being watched, but can't figure out where the eyes are. "So, what now?" Callum asked, trying to shake off the feeling. "You get back to your people once we hit Seraphis." Neria turned toward him, her bright blue eyes catching the starlight in a way that made her seem almost otherworldly. "I don't know," she replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "I was supposed to be a part of something much larger, a force for peace and goodwill in the galaxy. But after what happened to my ship, I feel lost. I don't know what I can offer anymore. My mission was to help others, but now I have nothing to return to." Callum couldn't help but feel a sense of empathy for her. He knew what it was like to lose everything, to feel like there was no place for you in the universe. He had lived through his own personal battles, but unlike Neria, he didn't have a higher purpose to fall back on. He was just a smuggler, a loner by choice. "You've got a lot to offer," Callum said, his voice softening. "I mean, you've got those two companions of yours. You've got skills, and you're alive. You've already proven a lot by surviving out there on Traskar. I'm sure someone could use a hand like yours." Neria gave him a faint smile, her expression grateful, yet tinged with uncertainty. "Maybe, but I feel like the universe has more plans for me than I can understand right now." Callum didn't press the subject further. He wasn't one to delve into deep philosophical conversations. Instead, he adjusted his grip on the controls, focusing on the ship's trajectory as they flew deeper into uncharted space. But as he glanced at the navigation panel, something caught his eye. A flicker, a blip on the radar. It wasn't much, just a small disturbance, but it was enough to send a shiver down Callum's spine. He had been in space long enough to know when something was wrong. "Did you see that?" Callum muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he studied the readings. Neria looked at him, her expression turning serious. "What is it?" "Nothing good," Callum replied, his fingers flying over the console as he scanned the area. The blip had vanished, but Callum wasn't convinced. Something didn't feel right. Could be a ship, maybe a stray freighter. But it's too close to our trajectory for comfort. His mind raced as he adjusted the ship's course, subtly veering to the side to avoid what he suspected might be a hidden threat. Callum wasn't just paranoid. He had a finely honed sense for trouble. In his line of work, it paid to be cautious. But this time, he wasn't sure what he was dealing with. "Could be pirates again," Callum muttered, more to himself than to Neria. "I've seen enough pirate raids in my time to know when something smells fishy." "What do we do?" Neria asked, her voice steady but concerned. She seemed to trust Callum's judgment, perhaps more than he expected. "We keep moving," Callum said firmly, a sudden sense of urgency creeping into his voice. "I'm not about to let some raiders ruin my day. I'll just adjust the course, keep my distance, and we'll be fine." But even as he said the words, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Callum had learned long ago that space was never as empty as it seemed. Even the quietest stretches of void often hid the most dangerous threats. As he watched the radar, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was closing in on them. He wasn't sure how, but he knew they weren't alone anymore. The ship jolted suddenly, the engine sputtering in a way that made Callum's stomach lurch. A loud bang echoed through the hull, followed by the unsettling whine of something mechanical failing. "Damn it!" Callum cursed, slamming his fist on the console. He quickly checked the readings, trying to make sense of the problem. "We've got a breach in the rear engine compartment. I need to fix it before we lose power completely." Without another word, he stood up and motioned for Neria to stay in her seat. "Stay here. I'll go take a look." As Callum made his way toward the engine room, his mind raced. It wasn't just the mechanical failure that worried him, it was the timing. The malfunction had occurred almost immediately after he'd noticed the strange blip on the radar. Was it a coincidence? Callum wasn't sure. In the dimly lit engine room, Callum quickly began assessing the damage. A few wires had come loose, and some of the internal systems had been knocked offline. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to slow them down if he didn't fix it soon. His hands worked quickly, the sounds of the ship's hull creaking and groaning under the stress of the malfunction filling his ears. And then, as he was about to reconnect a power cable, he felt it, an eerie, unsettling sensation creeping up his spine. It was as though something was watching him. He froze, his heart racing in his chest. There was no sound at first, just a strange stillness that filled the room. But then he heard it, a faint humming, like the low vibration of a ship's engine, just outside the ship's hull. It was too close to be a coincidence. Callum's instincts kicked in. He rushed to finish the repairs, hoping to get the Iron Phoenix up to full speed before whoever, or whatever, was out there had a chance to make their move. But as the humming grew louder, Callum knew they weren't alone. He had to act fast, or they would be caught in a trap. Up on the bridge, Neria looked out the viewport, her sharp senses picking up the same strange presence in the air. Something was coming, something that wasn't supposed to be there. And neither Callum nor Neria could see what was waiting for them in the dark expanse of space, just beyond the edge of their radar. But whatever it wasn't just a coincidence. It was a force, one that was closing in on them, slowly and surely. Shadows in the void. The Iron Phoenix was drifting, its engine sputtering and groaning with every passing second. Callum's mind was racing, but he kept his focus as he worked tirelessly to restore the power systems. The hum of the ship's malfunctioning equipment buzzed around him, and the eerie sensation of being watched only grew stronger. He had been in this situation before, alone, under threat, with no allies in sight. Yet this time, it felt different. There was something more than just mechanical failure at play. It wasn't just a random malfunction. Someone had tampered with their systems. The thought gnawed at the back of his mind. As Callum worked to stabilize the ship's engine, a deep sense of urgency set in. He couldn't afford to waste time. Every second they spent floating out here, disabled, made them an easy target. Whoever or whatever had caused the breach in the first place wasn't going to give them any mercy. On the bridge, Neria sat at the controls, her gaze fixed on the darkness outside the viewport. The stars flickered in the distance, a calming sight, but something was wrong. Her heightened senses, home through years of survival and diplomatic missions, were screaming at her. She could feel it, the same sensation that Callum had experienced. The feeling of being hunted, of being watched. The hair on the back of her neck prickled, and for a moment she wondered if she had been followed since the moment she had left Traskar. But no, the pirates were too far behind, and they had left the planet's orbit long ago. This was something else. Neria. Callum's voice crackled through the intercom, his tone strained. "I need you to check the aft section. The engine's back online, but we're still not in the clear. I'm getting strange readings. Something's out there." Neria stood up swiftly, her every movement fluid and precise. She didn't hesitate. She had learned long ago not to question her instincts. Grabbing a small blaster from the ship's armory, something Callum kept for moments just like this, she moved toward the airlock, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. As she passed through the narrow corridors of the Iron Phoenix, Her mind wandered back to her home planet, Andari. She had never imagined she would be out here, drifting through the void, facing a threat she couldn't understand. Back on Andari, things were simpler. The Andari people lived in harmony with nature, their technology advanced but used responsibly, always focused on sustainability and peace. But the universe had other plans. The pirates, the crash, her current predicament, all of it felt like an endless nightmare, one she couldn't escape no matter how hard she tried. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming odds, Neria had not lost her sense of hope. Her mission, to help, to bridge the gap between civilizations, was still important to her. It was just, not the way she had envisioned it. And now, with Callum at her side, perhaps she could continue that mission, even if the road ahead was uncertain. When she reached the airlock, Neria keyed in the security code, the door sliding open with a soft hiss. She stepped into the back hall of the ship, her eyes alert to every movement. The low hum of the ship's systems was the only sound, the silence hanging heavy in the air. As she made her way toward the aft section, Neria's thoughts drifted back to the creatures, Nyx and Azora. They had been her companions, her protectors for so long. She had never allowed herself to become too attached to anything or anyone, not after what had happened on her homeworld. But Nyx and Azora were different. They had saved her life when a ship malfunction had stranded her on a hostile planet years ago. She owed them everything, and she would do anything to keep them safe. But safety seemed increasingly out of reach. The aft section of the ship was dimly lit, the low glow of emergency lights casting long shadows across the walls. Neria moved cautiously, every sense on high alert. The air was thick with tension as she approached the rear cargo hold. Her hand rested on the handle of the blaster at her side, ready for anything. The strange humming sound from earlier seemed to have intensified, almost as if it were vibrating through the hull of the ship. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. Neria froze, her heart racing. She knew something was wrong. A low mechanical whine reverberated through the ship, followed by the unmistakable sound of something or someone moving in the shadows. She wasn't alone. With her breath steady, she crept forward, each step calculated, her eyes narrowing as she peered around corners. The strange, foreign vibration grew louder, and the sense of being watched became nearly suffocating. She had to make it to the cargo hold and check the external systems, but something told her this wasn't just a mechanical failure. This was something far more dangerous. Suddenly, a shadow flickered just beyond her peripheral vision. Neria whipped around, her blaster raised, but there was nothing there. She didn't let her guard down. Something, or someone, was playing with her. Before she could react, an explosion of light and energy burst from the far end of the hall. Neria ducked instinctively, diving behind a metal crate as a barrage of laser fire streaked past her. The blast scorched the wall where she had been standing just a moment ago. "Callum," she shouted into the intercom, her voice sharp with urgency. "We're under attack. I need backup." Seconds later, Callum's voice crackled through. "I'm on my way. Stay down." Neria didn't wait for him to arrive. She rolled out from behind cover and sprinted toward the cargo hold. Her mind raced as she formulated a plan. Whoever was on board had known where to strike. The blast had been carefully aimed, precise. This wasn't a random attack. It was deliberate, calculated. The fact that they knew where to hit meant they had been watching them for longer than they had realized. Callum's earlier suspicion that something was wrong wasn't just a hunch, it was the truth. As she reached the rear hatch, Neria activated the door release, and it slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the dim light of the cargo hold barely illuminated the large crates and supplies that filled the space. She stepped cautiously into the room, scanning every corner for signs of movement. There it was again, the low, unsettling hum. It was coming from just beyond the farthest crate. Neria's breath hitched. She had no idea what she was about to face, but one thing was certain. Whoever or whatever was behind this attack wasn't a simple threat. Before she could make a move, The cargo hold door slammed shut behind her, locking with an audible click. Neria spun around, her blaster raised, only to be met with the sight of two humanoid figures stepping out from the shadows. They were tall, cloaked in dark, form-fitting armor that reflected the low light. Their faces were obscured by helmets, and their movements were eerily synchronized, like two halves of a single entity. "Didn't expect you to be so difficult," one of them said in a deep, modulated voice, as if their words had been filtered through a mechanical system. "But you're not going anywhere." Neria's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the weight of the situation closing in on her. These weren't just space pirates or mercenaries. They were something more, something much darker. Behind her, the sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor. Callum was coming, but would he be able to make it in time? The two armored figures raised their weapons, the energy blades flickering to life with a deadly hum. Neria's hand tightened around her blaster. She wasn't going down without a fight. "I suggest you rethink your position," Neria said, her voice cold and unwavering. "This is my ship, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take it from me." The figure closest to her chuckled darkly, the sound reverberating through his helmet. "We'll see about that," he said. In the shadows of the hold, Neria felt the tension build. The fight for her survival had only just begun. The blade of shadows. The Iron Phoenix shuddered again, and the hum of the engines faltered as though the ship itself was bracing for impact. Neria's heart raced as she tightened her grip on the blaster, her eyes locked on the two figures standing across from her. They moved like phantoms, fluid and silent, their dark armor reflecting the faint light from the cargo hold's overhead panels. The coldness in their gaze told her everything she needed to know. They were no ordinary mercenaries. This was something else entirely. "Let's get this over with," the taller of the two said, his voice flat and mechanical, like it was being transmitted through a series of filters. The words felt like a threat, heavy with intent. He lifted his weapon, an energy blade that crackled with electric power, and aimed it at Neria. She wasn't sure how much time she had before Callum would make it to her, but she knew it wouldn't be long. The advantage was hers, at least for now. The room was dim, the cargo hold filled with scattered crates that could serve as cover, and Neria was fast. She had learned to use the environment to her advantage on countless occasions, but there was something about these attackers that didn't sit right with her. They weren't just here to steal or destroy. They were here to kill. The smaller figure stepped forward, his movements precise and eerily coordinated with the larger one. There was no hesitation, no pause. They were professionals, and they weren't here to negotiate. "Come any closer and I will fire," Neria warned, her voice calm but carrying the authority of someone who had faced worse odds. The blaster in her hands was steady, aimed directly at the closest attacker. The two figures exchanged a brief glance, and then the smaller one nodded. "You don't understand, Andari," he said, his voice smooth, like a snake's hiss. "This is not your fight. Your world is too far gone for us to spare. You're in our way now, and that's a mistake you'll regret." Neria's mind raced, but her body was already in motion. She dove to the side, rolling behind a stack of crates, narrowly avoiding the sharp crackle of an energy blade that sliced through the air just above her. The blade made a sizzling sound as it cleaved through the space where she had been moments ago. Before she could regain her footing, the larger attacker leaped toward her, his armored boots making a heavy thud against the metal floor. Neria had no time to react with another shot. Instead, she kicked off from the ground, twisting in midair as she sent a powerful elbow into the side of the nearest crate. It toppled over with a crash, creating a temporary barricade. The attacker swung his blade again, narrowly missing her, but Neria was already back on her feet, her blaster raised once more. She fired a single shot, a pulse of energy that sent the figure stumbling back as sparks flew from his armor. He growled in frustration, but the hit had done little to slow him down. She needed more time. Time for Callum to get to her. Time to figure out what the hell was going on. But as she glanced toward the entrance to the cargo hold, she saw no sign of him. There was only the echo of the ship's engines struggling to stay online and the increasingly desperate feeling that the attackers were closing in on her. "Callum," she shouted again, her voice now filled with urgency. "We're not alone." A few moments later, a series of rapid footsteps echoed from the hall beyond. Callum emerged at the threshold of the cargo hold, his face grim, a pulse rifle in hand. He glanced quickly at Neria, then at the attackers, his eyes hardening. "Didn't expect a welcoming party," Callum said dryly, a hint of sarcasm in his voice, but there was no mistaking the seriousness of the situation. He swung the rifle into position, ready to engage. "Neria, get behind me. I'll cover you." Neria nodded sharply, her earlier concerns now pushed aside. With Callum's firepower, they might have a fighting chance. The two attackers moved in synchrony, their eyes locked on Callum as they prepared to counterattack. They weren't reacting like normal mercenaries. They were waiting for something more. Callum fired first, the sharp report of the pulse rifle splitting the air. A series of shots rang out, hitting the smaller figure in the chest, sending him reeling backward. Sparks erupted from the impact points, and the figure staggered, his body crackling with electrical feedback. But instead of falling, he grinned, his stance unshaken. "You think you can stop us, human?" The attacker sneered. "You're nothing but an obstacle." Callum didn't flinch. Instead, he fired again, aiming for the figure's exposed joints, the only weak points in his armor. Each shot was calculated, precise. The larger figure moved in a blur, lunging toward Callum with frightening speed, his energy blade arcing through the air in a deadly sweep. Callum barely had time to sidestep, but he wasn't quick enough. The blade slashed across his shoulder, leaving a burn mark on his flight jacket. He gritted his teeth against the pain, but he didn't slow down. This wasn't the time to back off. Neria didn't hesitate. She grabbed a nearby crate and hurled it with all her strength, sending it crashing into the larger figure's side. The attacker staggered back, momentarily thrown off balance. That was all Callum needed. He aimed his rifle once more, firing a blast that struck the attacker square in the chest. The force of the shot knocked the larger figure back, his energy blade falling from his hand as he crumpled to the ground. "Get up," Neria muttered, her voice tight with determination, as she grabbed Callum's arm and helped him back to his feet. "We're not done yet." They moved quickly, finding cover as the smaller attacker recovered from Callum's previous shots. His armor was still sparking, but he was far from defeated. The smile had returned to his face as if he relished the fight. "We weren't expecting you to be so difficult," he said, his voice oozing with disdain. "But you'll learn soon enough. It's not your ship that's important. It's what's inside it that matters." Neria felt a chill run down her spine. The words echoed in her mind, but she couldn't make sense of them. What was inside the ship? As if reading her thoughts, the figure took a step forward, his weapon glowing with an eerie energy. "The Iron Phoenix is just a vessel," he continued, his voice low and dangerous. "But the cargo you're carrying, well, that's worth more than your lives." Suddenly, everything clicked. Her mind flashed back to the moment she had first met Callum. The crystals, the ones she had heard were highly coveted, rare and dangerous. But there was something more, something they hadn't known about the cargo. These attackers weren't just after any valuable artifact. They were after something far more elusive. And the Iron Phoenix was the key to unlocking whatever it was. The realization hit Neria like a wave. Her survival, Callum's survival, everything hinged on understanding what these mysterious figures were after. She had to act quickly. She turned to Callum, urgency now in her voice. "The crystals, Callum. They're not just crystals. They're more than that. These people, they're after something else. Something we don't fully understand." Callum's eyes widened as he processed her words. For the first time, the gravity of the situation sank in. Then we need to get to the bottom of it. Fast, Callum said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. He took a deep breath, glancing at the downed attacker, then at the other still standing figure. We don't have much time. Neria nodded. It wasn't just about survival anymore. They were up against a force far greater than either of them could have imagined. It was time to find out what they were really after. And more importantly, why the Iron Phoenix was the key to it all.